The courtroom stood quiet in the early morning light, an imposing hall of justice, polished marble floors reflecting the steady glow of chandeliers overhead. This was no ordinary day. Judge Nathan Blake, a name respected and feared within the city's judicial system, was about to open a critical trial, a high-profile corruption case that had already stirred powerful opposition and quiet threats. Blake, an African-American judge known for his unwavering principles and commitment to equality, had built a career on challenging abuses of power. His stance had won him both admirers and enemies, but today was different. Even he could feel a shadow over the proceedings, an unspoken tension weaving its way through the courthouse. In the grand hallway just outside the courtroom, his son, Jordan Blake, waited, his tall figure poised and collected, yet undeniably on edge. Dressed sharply in a dark suit, Jordan seemed almost a mirror image of his father, strong, determined, and bearing that same silent resilience. At 28, Jordan had inherited his father's unyielding sense of justice, although he had chosen a different path, working as a social advocate focused on community reform. He had arrived early that morning to support his father, hoping to share a few words before the trial. While his relationship with his father was respectful, it had often been strained. Nathan's relentless pursuit of reform sometimes cast a long shadow, pushing Jordan to grapple with his own place within a system that often seemed immovable. The hallway was mostly empty, filled only with the faint murmur of distant conversations. Jordan pulled out his phone to check the time and took a moment to glance at the stone-cold walls around him. This building, a fortress of law, was a familiar sight, yet today it felt unwelcoming. Something gnawed at his instincts, a subtle but growing discomfort. But he brushed it aside. Today was too important to be distracted by vague feelings. He scrolled briefly through a few emails, mentally preparing himself for the tense day ahead. Lost in his thoughts, Jordan barely noticed the shadow that approached until he felt the presence at his shoulder. Turning, he found himself face to face with Officer Derek Winters. A white police officer in his late 30s, Winters had a hardened expression that hinted at an edge of cynicism, even bitterness. He was known within the precincts as a man who believed in hard justice, someone who saw the world in black and white, friend or foe, right or wrong. In the past year, he'd been reprimanded twice for using excessive force, yet his superiors had let him off with minor warnings. Winters believed in the righteousness of his actions, even when others questioned his judgment. The officer sized Jordan up with a quick, disdainful glance. To Winters, the sight of a young black man in an expensive suit, alone in a place of such authority, seemed out of place. It ignited something instinctual within him, an urge to assert his control, to prove that he could uphold the order he so fiercely believed in. He saw himself as a gatekeeper in this world of rules, someone meant to protect it from those he saw as threats, whether real or imagined. "Can I help you with something?" Jordan asked, his tone polite yet guarded, sensing the tension in the officer's stance. Winters didn't respond immediately. His eyes narrowed slightly, and the silence stretched out, hanging between them. Finally he spoke, his voice low and laced with unspoken accusation. "You got any reason to be here?" He didn't even try to conceal the suspicion in his tone. Jordan was caught off guard. He took a steady breath, choosing his words carefully. "Yes, I'm here to support my father," he replied evenly. "He's the presiding judge on today's case." Winters raised an eyebrow, his skepticism clear. "Your father?" He scoffed slightly, the condescension almost palpable. "And who might that be?" "Judge Nathan Blake," Jordan replied firmly, his gaze steady as he met the officer's eyes. A flicker of recognition crossed Winters' face, but it was quickly replaced by a hardening scowl. To him, Judge Blake represented everything he loathed about the system. Liberal, reform-focused, someone who coddled criminals instead of delivering swift, punishing justice. The fact that he was now facing Blake's son felt almost like a personal affront. Winters took a step closer, invading Jordan's personal space. "You expect me to just believe that?" he said, voice dripping with sarcasm. "A young guy like you, dressed like that, just happens to be related to one of the most upstanding judges in this town. Seems unlikely." Jordan clenched his jaw, fighting the urge to respond with the frustration bubbling up inside him. He had seen this attitude before countless times. He'd been raised to expect it, even to navigate it with a controlled calm, but today it felt more intrusive, more personal. He could feel the eyes of the courthouse staff nearby, watching, waiting to see what would unfold. Taking a deep breath, he replied, "I don't see why I need to prove anything to you, officer. I have every right to be here." His voice was calm, but his eyes held a glint of defiance. Winter's face darkened. He was used to immediate compliance, especially from people like Jordan, who he assumed would be intimidated by his presence and authority. But this young man was standing his ground, refusing to back down. It struck at the core of his ego, his need to be the one in control. "Well, I don't think you do," Winters sneered. "For all I know, you're here for reasons that have nothing to do with your father. Maybe you're looking for trouble, trying to mess with the case, maybe—" He paused, letting his insinuations sink in. "Why don't you hand over your ID? Let's see if your story checks out." Jordan felt his pulse quicken, the tension thickening between them. He was here to support his father, to witness a moment of justice, not to be subjected to baseless accusations. But he knew that if he resisted now, the situation could spiral out of control, and that was exactly what Winters seemed to be hoping for. Against his better judgment, Jordan reached into his coat pocket, pulling out his ID. Winters snatched it with a smirk, scrutinizing it as though searching for some flaw, some reason to escalate his accusations. After a long moment, he handed it back with an expression that suggested nothing was settled. "Fine," Winters muttered, his tone still simmering with disdain. "But if I see any sign of trouble from you, even a hint, you can expect me to be right there." He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "Your father's not above the law, and neither are you. Understood?" Jordan met his gaze, refusing to flinch, though every muscle in his body was tensed. "I understand perfectly, officer." Winters held his stare for another moment before straightening up, adjusting his belt with a flourish meant to reassert his authority. With a final contemptuous look, he turned and walked away, his presence leaving a cold, lingering tension in the air. Jordan exhaled slowly, steadying himself. The encounter had left a sour taste, but he was determined not to let it cloud the purpose of his visit. Taking one last look down the corridor, he moved towards the courtroom doors, ready to support his father in what would likely be a long, arduous day. Yet, even as he entered the courtroom, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something much darker. The ominous exchange with Winters felt like a storm warning, a sign that forces were gathering against him and his father. And deep down, he knew that whatever was coming next would test every ounce of strength, patience, and integrity he possessed. As the trial proceedings began, the atmosphere in the courtroom was tense, charged with the anticipation of a hard-fought case. Judge Nathan Blake took his seat at the bench with the calm authority that had become his trademark, his gaze steely as he surveyed the room. Every eye was on him, every mind attuned to the weight of his upcoming rulings. Jordan sat near the back, observing his father's composed presence with quiet admiration. Despite their differences, he respected his father's dedication to the law, his commitment to fairness and truth. But just as the initial statements were being presented, Jordan's phone buzzed. He glanced down at the screen and saw an unexpected message from an unknown number. "Meet me outside. Now." Jordan's first instinct was to ignore it, but curiosity got the better of him. He slipped out of the courtroom quietly, moving through the empty hallways until he reached the courthouse steps. As he looked around, a sense of unease crept over him. He could feel someone watching him, an invisible tension tightening around him like a noose. And then from the corner of his eye, he saw Officer Derek Winters leaning against the courthouse wall, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Jordan's pulse quickened. He had hoped that his earlier encounter with Winters was over, a brief clash of personalities left behind in the hallway. But it was clear now that Winters hadn't let it go. The officer pushed himself off the wall and sauntered over, his gait slow and deliberate, every step calculated to assert dominance. "What are you doing here?" Jordan asked, his voice laced with suspicion. Winters gave him a lazy smirk. "I think the better question is, what are you doing here?" he replied, feigning casual curiosity. "Loitering around the courthouse, slipping out during a major trial. Makes a guy wonder what you're really up to, doesn't it?" Jordan took a steadying breath, reminding himself to stay calm. "I told you, I'm here to support my father. You've already seen my ID. There's nothing more to discuss." Winters chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "You think that little show in the hallway cleared you?" No, I don't think so. See, you're acting a little too confident for someone who should be watching his back." He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "Maybe I'm not buying this a dutiful son routine. Maybe I think there's more to it." Jordan's eyes narrowed. He could feel the trap tightening, but he wasn't about to let this man intimidate him. "I don't know what you're trying to prove, officer, but you're wasting your time. I haven't done anything wrong." Winters' gaze hardened, a flicker of something darker flaring in his eyes. "Let me tell you something, kid," he muttered. "I know your type. Think you're above the rules. Think your daddy's position gives you a free pass. But not on my watch." He straightened, tapping his badge with a pointed finger. "I'm here to keep the order, and I don't take kindly to people like you who think they can just stroll in here like they own the place." Jordan bristled, but he forced himself to remain outwardly calm. He'd dealt with this kind of prejudice before, but something about Winters felt different, more personal, more venomous, and he knew that pushing back too hard might escalate things beyond control. "Look," Jordan said evenly, "I'm not here to cause any trouble. I have every right to be in that courtroom, and you have no reason to be harassing me. So if there's nothing else, I'd like to get back to the trial." Winters' face twisted in anger, his jaw clenched tightly. It was clear that Jordan's refusal to cower had hit a nerve. For a moment, Winters just stood there, his fists balled at his sides, his gaze burning with barely restrained fury. And then, as though coming to a sudden decision, he took a step back and let out a slow, menacing smile. "All right, fine," he said. "Go back to your little seat and pretend like nothing's wrong. But don't think for a second that I'm done with you. I'll be watching every move you make." Jordan turned, ready to walk away, but as he did, Winters reached out and grabbed his arm, stopping him mid-stride. The officer's grip was tight, unyielding, and Jordan felt a surge of anger rise within him. He wanted to yank his arm free, to demand that Winters release him, but he knew that any sudden reaction could be used against him. "Is there a problem?" Jordan asked, his voice low and controlled. Winters leaned in, his voice a venomous hiss. "The problem is I don't trust you. I think you're hiding something and I'm going to find out what it is. So if I were you, I'd start thinking real carefully about what I do next." Jordan pulled his arm free, his expression hardening. "Stay away from me, officer," he said quietly, his tone laced with a warning of his own. Without waiting for a response, he turned and walked back into the courthouse, his steps steady but his mind racing. He had a sinking feeling that this was far from over. Winters was more than just an aggressive cop on a power trip. He was someone who seemed almost desperate to provoke a reaction, as though he had something to prove. And Jordan couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of a much bigger, more dangerous game. As he re-entered the courtroom, Jordan tried to refocus on the trial, on his father's steady voice as he presided over the case with calm authority. But his mind kept drifting back to Winters, to the officer's cold, unyielding gaze and the unspoken threats that lay beneath his words. For the first time, Jordan felt a genuine chill run down his spine. This wasn't just an isolated encounter. It was a sign, a warning that something darker was brewing, something that could threaten everything his father had fought for. The trial continued, each moment heavy with legal arguments and pointed exchanges between the lawyers. But for Jordan, the real battle was happening just outside, in the shadowy corridors of authority and power, where men like Winters prowled, waiting for any chance to assert their dominance. It was a reminder of the vulnerability he faced simply because of who he was and who his father was. And then, as if on cue, he noticed a movement at the back of the courtroom. Winters had returned, standing just outside the doors, his figure barely visible through the glass. He was watching, his eyes locked on Jordan, a silent predator waiting for his prey to slip up. Every glance, every shift of his body was loaded with threat, and Jordan could feel the weight of that gaze, even as he tried to ignore it. Just then, one of the attorneys called for a short recess, and Judge Blake announced a brief break. Jordan seized the opportunity, stepping outside to clear his head. But he barely had a moment to himself before Winters appeared beside him, as if summoned by his very thoughts. "Leaving so soon?" Winters sneered, his tone dripping with mockery. Jordan turned to face him, his patience wearing thin. "You're out of line, officer," he said sharply. "If you have a legitimate reason to be following me around, then state it. Otherwise, leave me alone." Winters' smile widened, a dangerous glint in his eyes. "You think you're untouchable, don't you? Think your father's going to keep you safe from the consequences of your actions?" He took a step closer, lowering his voice to a menacing whisper. "Well, let me tell you something, kid. Your father isn't the only one with power in this city." Jordan felt his temper flare, but he forced himself to hold back. He couldn't afford to lose control, not now, not when Winters was clearly baiting him. He clenched his fists, struggling to keep his voice steady. "This is harassment," Jordan said calmly, each word carefully measured. "And if you think I won't report it, you're wrong." Winters laughed, a cold, humorless sound. "Go ahead, report me. See where it gets you." He leaned in, his face inches from Jordan's. "But remember, I'll be watching, and sooner or later, I'm going to find exactly what I'm looking for." With that, Winters turned and walked away, leaving Jordan standing alone, a sense of dread settling over him. He knew now, beyond any doubt, that this was only the beginning. Officer Winters wasn't just trying to intimidate him, he was setting a trap, one that could drag both him and his father into a web of danger and deceit. And as he watched Winters disappear into the shadows, Jordan realized that he would need every ounce of his resolve to face what was coming next. The rest of the day unfolded like a tightening noose, each moment thickening with the unspoken hostility that seemed to radiate from Officer Derek Winters. Jordan had returned to his seat in the courtroom, doing his best to focus on the legal arguments and motions presented by the lawyers. But he could feel the weight of Winters' gaze even through the walls, that constant, oppressive presence lingering just outside the doors, waiting for any excuse to pounce. The case in question was a high-stakes corruption trial involving a city contractor accused of funneling public funds into a web of shell companies. Judge Nathan Blake had been chosen to preside over it due to his reputation for fairness and his insistence on transparent justice. But his integrity had also made him a target for those who preferred to operate in the shadows. This trial had become a powder keg in the city, a point of contention that had rattled the political elite. And now, with Jordan's presence, the stakes felt even higher. It was late afternoon when the proceedings took another brief recess. Judge Blake rose from his seat with his usual composure, giving a slight nod to the attorneys as he made his way to his chambers. Jordan decided to step outside, eager for a moment of fresh air, a break from the stifling tension that had only grown thicker since morning. But the moment he stepped into the hallway, he saw him. Winters was there, standing by the wall with his arms folded, his eyes fixed intently on Jordan. The officer's face was an unreadable mask, a mixture of cold calculation and simmering disdain. Jordan's instincts told him to ignore the man, to walk away without another word, but he knew that Winters was hoping for exactly that. For him to appear rattled or defensive. He refused to give Winters the satisfaction. "Do you have nothing better to do, officer?" Jordan asked, his tone calm but pointed. Winters pushed himself off the wall, his expression darkening. "You're not as smart as you think you are, kid," he muttered, stepping closer. "Or maybe you think that just because your daddy's in that room, I'm supposed to turn a blind eye to whatever you're up to." Jordan folded his arms, meeting Winters' gaze without a hint of fear. "I'm not up to anything, and you know it. The only one causing a scene here is you, officer. Perhaps you should reconsider how you're spending your time." Winters' jaw tightened, a muscle twitching at the edge of his mouth. "You think you can talk to me like that?" he hissed, his voice barely a whisper but charged with menace. "You think I don't know your type?" The little rich kid, all dressed up, thinking he can walk around like he owns the place, like the rules don't apply to him. Jordan's patience was wearing thin, and he could feel his composure slipping. But he took a deep breath, his father's voice echoing in his mind, urging him to stay calm. "Officer Winters," he said slowly, carefully, "I'm not here to cause any trouble. But if you continue to harass me, I'll have no choice but to report this. I know my rights, and I won't stand by while you abuse your position." A mocking grin spread across Winters' face, his eyes flashing with something dark and predatory. "Report me?" he laughed softly. "To who? Your father? You think I'm afraid of him?" He took another step closer, his voice dropping even lower. "You don't get it, do you? Men like me have been here long before you and your father came around, and will be here long after. I don't answer to anyone but the law, and right now the law says I can detain you if I have even a hint of suspicion." Jordan felt a chill run down his spine, the certainty that this man was dangerous solidifying in his mind. He knew that Winters wasn't bluffing. He was searching for an excuse, a way to provoke him into a reaction that would justify an arrest. Every instinct told him to walk away, but a spark of defiance held him rooted to the spot. "Then do it," Jordan said evenly, his gaze unwavering. "If you think I'm guilty of something, arrest me. But remember, Officer Winters, this won't end well for you. People are watching. You can't hide behind that badge forever." For a moment, Winters hesitated, his face contorted with rage. But then he seemed to make up his mind, his expression hardening as he reached for his radio. "This is Officer Winters. I'm requesting backup outside the courthouse." He spoke into the radio, his voice calm and steady, but his eyes never leaving Jordan's face. He took a step back, his hand hovering near his belt, fingers grazing the handcuffs. "You're coming with me for questioning. Let's see how much you like talking back once we're in a private room." Jordan clenched his fists, his heart pounding. He knew he was walking a fine line, One wrong move, and Winters would have all the justification he needed to escalate. But just as Winters' backup arrived, a pair of officers who looked both surprised and uncertain at the scene before them, a figure appeared at the far end of the hallway. It was Judge Nathan Blake. The judge strode forward, his posture as calm and authoritative as ever, but his eyes flashed with a mixture of anger and resolve. He took in the scene with a glance, noting the tense stance of the officers, his son's rigid posture, and Winters' barely concealed smirk. With an air of quiet command, he stepped between Jordan and Winters, his presence immediately shifting the balance of power. "Officer Winters," Judge Blake said, his voice a low, measured tone, "is there a reason you're detaining my son?" Winters opened his mouth, clearly caught off guard, but he quickly regained his composure, putting on a thin veneer of professionalism. "Judge Blake," he said, his tone just a bit too smooth, "I was merely investigating a suspicious individual. I didn't realize. He was your son." Nathan's gaze hardened, his expression unwavering. "And what exactly was suspicious about him?" Winters hesitated, searching for an answer. "He was loitering outside the courtroom during the trial. Given the nature of the case, I thought it best to question him." Nathan's eyes narrowed slightly, but his voice remained steady. "Loitering?" he repeated, his tone skeptical. "Officer, my son has every right to be here. He's done nothing wrong, and unless you have a valid reason to detain him, I suggest you let him go." Winters' face flushed, and for a moment he looked like he might argue, but then he glanced at the other officers, who were watching the exchange with growing unease, and seemed to think better of it. He forced a tight smile, his gaze cold and calculating. "Of course, Judge," he said, his voice strained. "Just a misunderstanding, I'm sure." He turned to Jordan, his expression unreadable. "You're free to go." Jordan felt a rush of relief, but it was tempered by the knowledge that this was far from over. As he met his father's gaze, he saw the flicker of concern in Nathan's eyes, and he knew that his father was just as aware of the underlying threat as he was. The judge placed a hand on Jordan's shoulder, guiding him away from Winters and the other officers. They walked down the hallway in silence, the tension between them unspoken but palpable. Only when they reached Nathan's chambers did the judge turn to face his son, his expression a mixture of worry and frustration. "Jordan," he said quietly, his voice laced with both reproach and concern. "What happened back there?" Jordan took a deep breath, gathering his thoughts. "Dad, that officer, he's been following me all day, harassing me, trying to get a rise out of me. I didn't want to make a scene, but he wouldn't let up." Nathan's gaze softened slightly, but there was still a hint of disapproval in his eyes. "I understand, son, but you know as well as I do that men like him feed off confrontation. They want you to react, to give them an excuse. You have to be smarter than that." "I know," Jordan replied, his voice tight. "But he was looking for any reason to arrest me. He was baiting me, Dad. And honestly, I'm tired of just standing by and taking it." Nathan sighed, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. "I understand your frustration, Jordan. Believe me, I do. But we have to pick our battles carefully. Men like Winters, they're dangerous because they believe they're untouchable. But they're also vulnerable because they're predictable." Jordan met his father's gaze, a hint of defiance in his eyes. "So what am I supposed to do? Just let him keep pushing me around?" "No," Nathan said firmly. "You do what you did today. You stand your ground, but you don't give him any ammunition, and you let me handle the rest." His voice softened. "I've been dealing with men like Winters my whole career. This isn't the first time someone's tried to intimidate me or my family, and it won't be the last. But if we're smart, if we're careful, we can make sure he pays for what he's done." Jordan nodded slowly, a sense of resolve settling over him. He knew his father was right, even if part of him still wanted to fight back, to confront Winters head-on. But he also knew that his father's approach was the smarter, more strategic path. He just hoped it would be enough. As they left the chambers, the judge leading the way back to the courtroom, Jordan caught a glimpse of Winters watching them from a distance, his face twisted with barely concealed rage, and in that moment, he understood that this was only the beginning of a much larger battle, one that would test both his patience and his courage. They returned to the courtroom, the trial resuming as though nothing had happened, but Jordan could feel the weight of Winters' hatred pressing down on him, a silent promise of retribution. And as he watched his father preside over the case with calm authority, he knew that they were walking a thin line, one wrong move away from a fall that could destroy everything they had worked for. Yet, despite the danger, despite the fear, Jordan felt a spark of defiance ignite within him. He wasn't going to let Winters win, Not today, not ever. And he would do whatever it took to protect his father and their shared vision of justice, no matter the cost. As the afternoon slipped into evening, the trial dragged on with no sign of slowing. The prosecution and defense went back and forth, dissecting every piece of evidence, every witness testimony. Judge Nathan Blake presided with his usual calm, issuing rulings with a steady hand, his voice cutting through the heated exchanges with firm authority. But beneath his controlled exterior, a storm was brewing. The incident with Officer Winters still lingered in his mind, a stark reminder that his fight for justice had far-reaching consequences, affecting not only his career, but also his family. Jordan, seated near the back of the courtroom, couldn't help but glance around, his instincts on high alert. The tension from his encounter with Winters refused to fade, leaving him in a state of restless vigilance. He was certain that Winters was lurking somewhere nearby, waiting for the right moment to make his next move. A sense of dread settled in his stomach as he watched his father, realizing that this trial was more than just another case. It was a test of his father's integrity, a test of Jordan's resilience, and a test of the system they both believed in. Then, as if on cue, his phone vibrated in his pocket. He glanced down, expecting a message from a colleague or a friend. Instead, it was another unknown number. He hesitated before opening it, but curiosity got the better of him. The message was brief, almost chilling in its simplicity. "Watch yourself, Blake." Jordan's heart pounded as he read the words. The implications were clear. Someone was watching him, monitoring his every move. And the way the message addressed him as Blake, using his father's name rather than his own, was a stark reminder of the shadow his father's work cast over him. This wasn't just about him. It was a threat, veiled but unmistakable, aimed at the judge through his son. He felt a surge of anger rising, a desire to confront Winters directly and end this twisted game of intimidation. But he knew that was exactly what Winters wanted. An outburst, a reaction, anything that would give him an excuse to tighten the noose. Taking a deep breath, he forced himself to calm down, remembering his father's words from earlier. "Be smart. Don't give him ammunition." As the trial reached another recess, Jordan stood up, stretching his legs and glancing towards the courtroom doors. His father had stepped out to speak with the court clerk, and the room was momentarily empty, save for a few security guards and clerks organizing files. He took the opportunity to slip into the hallway, hoping to clear his head. But he wasn't alone for long. The heavy click of footsteps echoed behind him, and before he could turn, he felt a hand clamp down on his shoulder. He spun around, coming face to face with Winters once again. The officer's face was unreadable, but there was a smug satisfaction in his eyes, a cold certainty that told Jordan this encounter was anything but a coincidence. "Leaving already?" Winters sneered, his grip tightening just enough to convey a sense of control. "I thought a good son would stick around to support his father." Jordan wrenched his shoulder away, glaring at Winters with barely concealed contempt. "I don't have time for your games, officer," he said, his voice laced with irritation. "I don't know what you think you're accomplishing, but I suggest you back off." Winters tilted his head, his smile widening. "Back off?" he repeated, his tone mocking. "See, that's your problem, Blake. You think you're untouchable, that just because Daddy's got the robe, you're safe. But let me tell you something, nobody's safe. Not even your old man." Jordan's fists clenched at his sides, his pulse pounding in his ears. He had heard enough. "What is this really about, Winters? Is it because of my father? Is this some kind of vendetta?" Winters's face hardened, the mask slipping for a brief moment, revealing a glimpse of the bitterness and resentment beneath. "Vendetta? Call it whatever you want. Men like your father sit in judgment, handing down verdicts like they're gods, deciding who's right and who's wrong. They pretend they're cleaning up the city, but they're just as corrupt as the criminals they condemn. And I've seen enough to know that it's time someone brought them down a notch." Jordan's stomach tightened, a chill running through him as he processed Winters's words. This wasn't just about him. It was about everything his father represented, every case he had ever ruled on. Winters wasn't just a cop with a grudge. He was a man on a mission, a misguided crusade fueled by anger and prejudice. "You have no idea what you're talking about," Jordan replied, his voice shaking with controlled fury. "My father has dedicated his life to justice, to doing what's right. He's not the one abusing his power here." "That's you!" Winters laughed, a harsh grating sound that echoed through the empty hallway. "Is that what you tell yourself to sleep at night? That your daddy's some kind of saint?" He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a sinister whisper. "Face it, Blake. The system's rigged, and men like your father are the ones holding the strings. But not for long." Before Jordan could respond, Winters turned and walked away, leaving him standing alone, the officer's words reverberating in his mind. He wanted to shake it off, to dismiss it as the ranting of a bitter man, but there was something in Winters's tone, a chilling certainty that made him question just how far the officer was willing to go to make his point. As Jordan re-entered the courtroom, he felt a new weight pressing down on him, a sense of foreboding that he couldn't ignore. His father was already back at the bench, his face a calm mask as he listened to the lawyer's arguments. But Jordan couldn't help but wonder, was his father aware of the storm gathering around them? Did he know that there were people, men like Winters, who wanted to see him fall? For the rest of the session, Jordan remained tense, glancing occasionally towards the back of the room, half expecting Winters to reappear. The officer didn't show, but the tension in the air was palpable, a silent threat that hung over them like a dark cloud. When the trial finally adjourned for the day, Judge Blake descended from the bench, his face lined with exhaustion. Jordan approached him, ready to share what had happened, but his father held up a hand, cutting him off. "Not here," he murmured, his voice barely audible. "Let's go somewhere private." They left the courtroom together, walking in silence until they reached Nathan's chambers. Once the door was closed, Jordan finally let his frustration spill over. "Dad, we have to do something about Winters," he said, his voice filled with urgency. "He's not just harassing me, he's targeting you too. He's convinced that you're part of some corrupt scheme. He said he's going to bring you down." Nathan sighed, rubbing his temples. "I know, Jordan. I've seen men like him before. They come into this system with good intentions, thinking they can fix it by any means necessary. But over time, that desire to make a difference becomes twisted, corrupted. They start seeing threats where there are none, and in the end, they become the very thing they once despised." Jordan shook his head, a sense of helplessness washing over him. "So what do we do? Just wait until he decides to make his move?" Nathan met his son's gaze, his eyes filled with a weary determination. "No. We prepare. We document everything, every encounter, every word he said to you. Men like Winters thrive on intimidation, on making their victims feel isolated and powerless. But if we expose his actions, if we show the world who he really is, we take away his power." Jordan took a deep breath, nodding slowly as he absorbed his father's words. It wasn't the immediate action he had hoped for, but he understood the wisdom behind it. This was a battle that would be won not through force, but through patience, strategy, and resilience. As they left the courthouse that evening, the city lights casting long shadows across the steps, Jordan felt a renewed sense of purpose. Winters may have thought he could tear them down, but he had underestimated the strength of their resolve. They would not be intimidated, and they would not be silenced. But as they walked towards the parking lot, a figure emerged from the shadows, blocking their path. It was Winters, his face twisted into a grim smile, his eyes gleaming with malice. "Leaving so soon, Judge?" he sneered, his voice dripping with mock politeness. "I thought we could have a little chat." Nathan placed a steadying hand on Jordan's arm, signaling him to stay calm. He faced Winters with a quiet dignity, refusing to be intimidated. "I don't have time for games, officer. If you have something to say, say it." Winters stepped closer, his face inches from Nathan's. "I just wanted to remind you that you're not untouchable. Not you, and certainly not your son. Sooner or later, you're going to slip up, and when you do, I'll be there. And no robe, no title, no reputation is going to save you." Nathan's gaze didn't waver. "Is that a threat, officer?" Winters smiled, his expression cold and calculated. "Take it however you want, Judge. But remember, everyone falls eventually. And when you do, I'll be there to catch you." With that, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the night, leaving father and son standing alone, the weight of his words lingering in the air. As they made their way to the car, Jordan looked at his father, a sense of urgency gripping him. "Dad, we have to take this seriously. He's not going to stop." Nathan nodded, his expression grave. "I know, Jordan, and neither will we." The days that followed were a relentless assault on Jordan's patience and his father's resolve. Officer Winters had taken his harassment to a new level, shadowing Jordan's every move, making it clear that he had no intention of letting up. Jordan could feel the oppressive weight of the officer's gaze at every turn, a dark presence that seemed to follow him from his apartment to the courthouse, from his meetings to his coffee breaks. Winters was everywhere and nowhere all at once, leaving Jordan with the sickening feeling that he was constantly being watched. At first, Jordan tried to ignore it, to focus on his work and his father's trial, but the pressure was becoming unbearable. He knew that Winters was pushing him, hoping he'd make a mistake or lash out, providing the excuse he needed to arrest him. And as much as he tried to follow his father's advice, staying calm, documenting every incident, the stress was taking its toll. Sleep was a distant memory, his mind haunted by the officer's taunts, by the veiled threats that seemed to echo in his ears even in the silence of his own home. But Jordan wasn't the only one feeling the strain. Judge Blake had always been a man of unshakable resolve, his reputation built on his impartiality and integrity. But even he was starting to show signs of wear. Winters's constant presence was like a crack in the foundation of his life's work, a reminder that there were forces in the system that resisted change, that would go to any lengths to silence those who sought justice. One afternoon, Jordan was leaving a meeting with a community group he'd been advising, a project he'd started to improve policing relations in underprivileged neighborhoods. As he walked through the quiet alleyway behind the building, his phone vibrated. He pulled it out, expecting a message from his father or a friend. But what he saw instead made his stomach drop. It was a video, grainy, shot from a distance. It showed him standing outside his father's chambers, talking to Nathan after the last day in court. The angle suggested that it had been taken from some hidden location, a place where only someone deliberately spying would have chosen to stand. And then came the caption, scrawled in cold, mocking text, "You think you're safe?" Jordan's hands trembled as he clutched his phone, bile rising in his throat. This was no longer just harassment. This was a psychological assault, a way of reminding him that he was never truly alone, that Winters had eyes on him wherever he went. He felt trapped, as though the walls were closing in, as though every step he took only led him further into the officer's twisted game. He considered calling his father, but what good would it do? Nathan was already under enough pressure, balancing his duties in court with the knowledge that his son was being targeted. The last thing he wanted was to add to his father's burden, so clenching his jaw, Jordan resolved to handle this on his own. He'd faced men like Winters before, people who wielded power like a weapon, who believed that fear was a means of control, but he wouldn't give Winters the satisfaction of seeing him break. Still, the video haunted him. That night, sleep eluded him once again, his mind racing with questions. How far was Winters willing to go? And more importantly, what would it take to finally expose him, to strip away the facade of authority and reveal the corruption underneath? The following day, the trial resumed, and Jordan sat quietly in the back of the courtroom, doing his best to maintain his composure. Judge Blake was speaking, his voice steady and commanding as he addressed the jury. But even as he listened to his father's words, Jordan felt a creeping sense of unease. It was as though he could feel Winters watching him, his gaze like a physical weight pressing down on him. And then, just as the defense attorney began cross-examining a witness, the doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. Winters entered, his expression blank, his movements unhurried as he took a seat near the front, his eyes fixed not on the witness or the attorneys, but directly on Jordan. The message was clear: "I'm here and I'm watching." Jordan's stomach churned, but he forced himself to stay still, his face impassive. He wouldn't give Winters the reaction he was looking for, but inside he was seething. How had this man, this so-called officer of the law, been allowed to abuse his power so blatantly, to torment an innocent person under the guise of law enforcement? As the trial session finally drew to a close, Judge Blake rose from the bench, his gaze briefly meeting his son's. There was a flicker of worry in his eyes, a silent acknowledgement that he too had seen Winters' presence and understood the implications. But, ever the professional, he kept his expression neutral, excusing the jury before retreating to his chambers. Jordan lingered in the courtroom, waiting until most of the spectators had filtered out before heading towards his father's chambers. He felt a shadow at his back as he walked down the hallway, an invisible force that seemed to pulse with each step. When he reached his father's door, he turned, half expecting to see Winters standing there, watching him with that smug grin. But the hallway was empty, the silence punctuated only by the hum of the courthouse's air conditioning. He knocked and entered, finding his father seated at his desk, reviewing a stack of papers. Judge Blake looked up, his face lined with exhaustion. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the weight of their unspoken fears filling the room. Finally, Jordan broke the silence. "Dad, we can't keep letting him do this," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "He's not just following me anymore. He's leaving messages, threats. He's escalating." Nathan sighed, leaning back in his chair. "I know, son. Believe me, I know. But you have to understand. People like him, They thrive on intimidation. They want us to feel cornered, to make a mistake. Jordan clenched his fists, frustration boiling over. So what are we supposed to do? Just let him walk all over us? Let him keep treating us like this? The judge regarded him with a steady gaze, his voice soft but firm. No, we document everything. We stay vigilant. And when the time comes, we use his own actions against him. Men like Winters eventually expose themselves, Jordan, but only if we stay calm, if we don't let him provoke us. Jordan shook his head, anger simmering just below the surface. Dad, I can't just sit back and do nothing. He's out there waiting for one of us to slip up, and it's only a matter of time before he does something we can't come back from. Nathan leaned forward, placing a reassuring hand on his son's shoulder. I know it's hard, Jordan, but trust me, this isn't the first time I've dealt with someone like Winters. He's a bully, and bullies only have power if we give it to them. If we stay focused, if we stick together, we'll come out of this stronger. I promise you. But even as he spoke, a shadow of doubt flickered in Nathan's eyes, a brief glimmer of uncertainty that he quickly masked. Jordan saw it, felt it, and his resolve wavered. How could they fight a man who seemed to have the entire system on his side, a man who could manipulate the law to serve his own twisted agenda? They sat in silence for a few moments, the air thick with unspoken fears. Finally, Jordan rose, nodding to his father before turning to leave. But as he opened the door, he froze. Winters was standing in the hallway, his expression dark and unreadable. He didn't say a word, but the look in his eyes spoke volumes. It was a look that promised retribution, that told Jordan he wasn't just a target. He was a pawn in a game that Winters had been playing for years. Something wrong, Blake? Winters sneered, his voice laced with mock concern. You look tense. Jordan fought the urge to respond, to let his anger spill over. Instead, he took a steadying breath, forcing himself to remain calm. I don't have time for this, officer. Winters' smile widened, his eyes gleaming with malice. Oh, but I think you do. You see, I'm just doing my job, making sure everything is in order. He leaned in, lowering his voice to a menacing whisper. And believe me, I'll keep doing it, every day, every hour, until one of you slips. Jordan held his gaze, refusing to back down. If you think you can scare us, you're wasting your time. We're not afraid of you. Winters chuckled, his voice a low, sinister rumble. We'll see about that. With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Jordan standing alone in the doorway, a sense of dread tightening around his heart. He knew that this wasn't over, that Winters had no intention of backing down, and as he looked back at his father, he saw the same resolve in Nathan's eyes, a determination to stand strong, no matter the cost. But deep down, a question lingered, one that neither of them dared to voice. How far was Winters willing to go? And what would they have to sacrifice to finally put an end to his reign of terror? The final day of the trial arrived, and the courtroom was packed. The case had attracted significant attention, both for the high-profile corruption charges and for Judge Nathan Blake's uncompromising stance. For days, he had meticulously directed the proceedings, maintaining a balance between the defense and the prosecution, demanding clarity and precision from every witness. But behind his composed exterior, Nathan was fighting his own private battle, a battle against an enemy who lurked not in the witness stand, but in the corridors of his life, wielding authority as a weapon. Jordan sat near the front, tense but resolute, his gaze never leaving his father. The past week had been a whirlwind of harassment, intimidation, and psychological warfare, all courtesy of Officer Winters. Jordan had done his best to stay strong, but Winters' relentless pursuit had worn him down, forcing him to confront a side of himself he had always tried to keep buried, a side that was ready to fight back. As the trial neared its conclusion, Judge Blake addressed the court one final time, summarizing the gravity of the charges and reminding the jury of their duty. His voice was steady, filled with the weight of years spent upholding justice. But even as he spoke, he could feel Winters' presence in the room, a dark, simmering force waiting for the right moment to strike. And then, as Nathan adjourned the court for deliberations, it happened. Winters stood up from his seat at the back of the courtroom, his face set in a hard, determined expression. He walked purposefully toward the front, drawing the attention of everyone present. The murmur of voices grew as he approached the bench, stopping only a few feet from where Nathan stood. The courtroom fell silent, the air thick with tension as all eyes shifted to Winters. Judge Blake, Winters announced, his voice loud and clear, ringing with an authority that demanded attention. I need to speak with you privately, now. Nathan's expression didn't waver, but Jordan could see a flicker of surprise in his eyes. He sensed that his father knew exactly what this was. A final attempt by Winters to intimidate, to assert dominance in a place where he had no true power. "This isn't the time or place for a private conversation, Officer Winters," Judge Blake replied calmly, his voice unwavering. "If you have a concern, I suggest you address it through the appropriate channels." Winters's jaw clenched, a flash of anger crossing his face. "No," he said, his tone cold and unyielding. "This can't wait. It's a matter of pressing concern." His eyes darted to Jordan, and for a moment, Jordan felt the weight of Winters' hatred bearing down on him like a physical force. Jordan knew that this was it, the moment Winters had been waiting for, the culmination of his twisted game. He was here to push, to provoke, to tear apart the fragile shield of restraint that Judge Blake and his son had held up all this time. "Officer Winters," Nathan said, his voice firm but controlled, "whatever your issue may be, this is neither the time nor the place. Please remove yourself from my courtroom, or I will have no choice but to have you removed." A hush fell over the room. This was the judge's final line in the sand, a declaration that he would not be bullied, that his authority would not be undermined in his own court. But Winters merely smiled, a slow, chilling smile that sent a shiver down Jordan's spine. "Is that right, Judge?" Winters replied, his voice dripping with disdain. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're the one who's been bending the rules. Protecting your own." He shot a look at Jordan, his eyes gleaming with satisfaction. "Everyone knows how your son has been loitering around, poking his nose where it doesn't belong. Who's to say he hasn't been interfering with the trial?" The room erupted into murmurs, the spectators whispering in hushed tones, scandalized by the accusation. Jordan felt a surge of anger, but he kept his expression neutral, clenching his fists beneath the table. He knew this was exactly what Winters wanted, a reaction, a crack in their armor. But he wouldn't give him the satisfaction. Nathan's face was stony, his gaze unflinching as he addressed Winters. "You're out of line, officer," he said, each word carefully measured. "My son has done nothing wrong, and I will not tolerate baseless accusations in my courtroom. This is your final warning." But Winters was beyond listening. He took a step closer, his voice rising, laced with barely controlled fury. "You think you're above the law, don't you, Judge? You and your son, acting like you're untouchable. But I'm here to make sure justice is served, even if it means taking down men like you." Judge Blake's patience finally snapped, his voice cutting through the noise like a blade. "Enough. Officer Winters, leave this courtroom immediately. I am placing you under official investigation for harassment and misconduct. You have abused your authority, and it ends now." A stunned silence fell over the room. Winters's face turned a shade of red, his fists clenched at his sides. For a brief, terrifying moment, Jordan thought the officer might lash out, that the restraint holding him back might finally break. But then, in a move that shocked everyone, Winters straightened, his expression darkening as he pointed a finger at Judge Blake. "This isn't over," he spat, his voice trembling with rage. "I'll make sure you both pay for this. You hear me, Blake? Both of you." With that, he turned and stormed out of the courtroom, his footsteps echoing through the silence. The tension hung heavy in the air, an electric charge that left everyone speechless. Jordan looked at his father, seeing the exhaustion etched into his face, the weight of years spent battling men like Winters. But in that moment, he also saw something else, a quiet triumph, a defiance that refused to be crushed. Nathan Blake had stood his ground, had refused to be intimidated, and in doing so, he had exposed Winters for who he truly was. The officer's threats, his attempts at intimidation, all lay bare for the world to see. As the courtroom slowly emptied, Jordan approached his father, a mixture of pride and relief filling him. He knew this wasn't the end. There would be fallout, investigations, and perhaps even more threats. But for now they had won a small but significant victory. They had faced the darkness and emerged, if not unscathed, then at least undefeated. "Dad," Jordan said quietly, placing a hand on his father's shoulder. "We did it." "We stood up to him." Nathan nodded, his eyes weary but resolute. "Yes, son. But remember, this is just the beginning. Men like Winters, they don't give up easily. He'll try again, maybe in ways we can't predict. But as long as we stand together, we can face whatever comes our way." Jordan nodded, feeling a renewed sense of determination. Winters may have thought he could break them, but he had underestimated their strength, their unity. And as they left the courthouse that evening, father and son walking side by side, they knew that whatever lay ahead, they would face it together, ready for the next battle, prepared to keep fighting for justice, no matter the cost. The days following the dramatic showdown in the courtroom brought a quiet but profound sense of change. News of the incident with Officer Winters had spread quickly, especially among courthouse staff, and whispers of his misconduct reached the upper levels of the precinct. The internal investigation that Judge Blake had set into motion moved swiftly, fueled by accounts from court staff who had witnessed Winters's behavior and by the mounting complaints Jordan and his father had meticulously documented. Jordan stayed close to his father during those tense days, each knowing that the results of the investigation could go either way. But in the end, the evidence against Winters was overwhelming. Testimonies from colleagues, security footage that captured his threatening behavior in the courthouse halls, and Jordan's video evidence of the surveillance attempts painted a damning picture. Under mounting pressure, Winters was quietly suspended, pending the results of a formal disciplinary hearing. For Jordan and Judge Blake, it was a victory, albeit a quiet one. There would be no public retribution, no grand statement condemning Winters' actions, but they knew justice had been served. Winters would be held accountable, and, as Nathan reminded his son, sometimes the quiet victories are the most lasting. One afternoon after a long day in court, Judge Blake called Jordan into his chambers. He poured them each a cup of tea, a rare break from his usual work-focused routine, and settled into his chair, a soft look in his eyes as he regarded his son. "We've faced men like Winters before," Nathan began, his voice reflective, "and we'll face them again. But this," he paused, choosing his words carefully, "this was different, because it wasn't just about me, it was about you too. And I saw a strength in you these past weeks that makes me prouder than I can put into words." Jordan felt a surge of warmth and respect for his father. The past few weeks had tested him in ways he hadn't anticipated, but standing by his father, learning from his calm resilience, had changed something in him. "You taught me that strength, Dad," he replied, his voice steady. "If I hadn't watched you, if I hadn't seen the way you held your ground, I don't know if I could have done it." Nathan smiled, a quiet pride in his expression. "We've both learned from this, son, and we'll carry that forward. The law can be a difficult path, filled with shadows and resistance, but as long as there are people willing to stand up for what's right, even in the face of those shadows, justice will always have a chance." They sat in a comfortable silence, the unspoken understanding between them stronger than any words. This battle had strengthened their bond, uniting them in a way they hadn't anticipated. They both knew that men like Winters would continue to test them, to push the boundaries of authority, but they also knew they were ready to face it, together. In the days that followed, life slowly returned to normal. Jordan resumed his work in community advocacy, now with a new sense of purpose and an understanding of the complexities and compromises of the legal system. He realized that justice wasn't always about grand gestures. It was about the small, steady acts of resistance, the quiet courage to stand firm when no one else would. One evening, as he left his office after a long meeting, he found his father waiting for him outside, leaning against his car, his face illuminated by the golden hues of the setting sun. Nathan raised a hand in greeting, a small smile playing at the corner of his lips. "I thought I'd treat you to dinner," Nathan said, his tone light. "Consider it a celebration of what we've overcome and of what's yet to come." Jordan returned the smile, a sense of peace settling over him. "I'd like that, Dad." As they drove off, the city stretched before them, a place filled with both challenges and promises. They knew that they would continue to face adversity, that there would be more Winterses, more battles for justice and integrity, but they also knew that together they were stronger than any force that sought to divide them. And as they shared a quiet meal that evening, father and son united by purpose and resilience, they realized that they weren't just fighting for themselves. They were fighting for everyone who believed in justice, in truth, and in the courage to stand firm in the face of darkness.